were to identify the precise moment at which literature ceased to be primarily concerned with external action and began to interrogate the inner processes of thought itself, one would inevitably arrive at the figure of James Joyce. Joyce does not merely narrate events. He reconstructs the very movement of consciousness. He transforms narrative from a representation of what happens into an exploration of how experience is perceived, processed, and remembered. In doing so, he fundamentally alters not only the form of the novel, but the very nature of literary representation. However, to understand Joyce's innovations, one must first understand the psychological and historical pressures that shaped his imagination. For Joyce's work is not simply experimental. It is deeply rooted in his own life, to the extent that it often reads as an extended act of self-examination. Welcome everyone. Today, we are going to explore the story of James Joyce. Joyce was born in Dublin in 1882 into a family that initially enjoyed a degree of social respectability, but gradually descended into financial instability. This decline was not merely economic, it was psychological. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was a man of considerable charm, wit, and cultural refinement, yet also marked by irresponsibility and an inability to manage finances. As the family circumstances deteriorated, young Joyce experienced not simply poverty, but the collapse of authority and stability. The father, who should represent order and security, becomes instead a figure of inconsistency and failure. This experience of decline becomes central to Joyce's imagination. It produces in him an acute awareness of the fragility of social structures, like family, religion, nation, all of which appear not as stable foundations, but as systems prone to collapse. This sense of instability is not merely thematic. It becomes structural, influencing the fragmented, fluid nature of his narrative techniques. Equally formative is Joyce's Jesuit education, which provided him with a rigorous intellectual framework grounded in Catholic theology. The Jesuits emphasized discipline, logic, and a systematic approach to knowledge. Joyce absorbed this intellectual precision, and it would later inform his aesthetic theories, particularly his engagement with Thomistic philosophy. However, alongside intellectual formation, this education also imposed a powerful moral system, one that operated through guilt, confession, and the constant surveillance of thought. The result is a complex psychological relationship with religion. Joyce neither fully accepts nor completely rejects Catholicism. Instead, he internalizes it. The language of sin, redemption, and judgment remains embedded in his consciousness, even as he resists its authority. This internalization is crucial because it means that Joyce's rebellion is never simple. It is always haunted by what it rejects. Another essential dimension of Joyce's life is his decision to live in exile. He leaves Ireland at a relatively young age and spends most of his life in continental Europe. Yet this geographical distance does not result in detachment. On the contrary, Joyce's writing remains intensely focused on Dublin. This paradox must be understood carefully. Joyce does not leave Ireland in order to forget it. He leaves in order to see it more clearly. Distance allows him to transform personal experience into artistic material. Now, while the Romantic tradition epitomized by Wordsworth defines poetry as an emotion recollected in tranquility, Joyce reconfigures the spatial and temporal distance through the lens of voluntary exile. For Joyce, the tranquility required for creation was not a peaceful rural retreat, but the geographical and psychological detachment provided by cities like Trieste and Paris. From this distance, the chaotic, kinetic triggers of Dublin, the stifling Catholicism, the paralyzed politics, and the decaying family structure could be filtered and reconstructed into static art. However, where the romantic recollection seeks a restorative harmony with nature, Joyce's recollection serves a diagnostic purpose. His distance acts as a magnifying glass, allowing him to map the paralysis of his home with a clinical precision that would have been impossible had he remained submerged in its immediate atmosphere. Thus, Exile becomes the laboratory of memory, where the spontaneous overflow of Irish experience is disciplined by the rigorous aesthetic control of the expatriate artist. Thus, in an examination, one must argue that Joyce's exile is not a form of escape, but a method of artistic control. By positioning himself outside Ireland, he gains the perspective necessary to reconstruct it in detail, while simultaneously subjecting it to critical scrutiny. Now, to situate Joyce properly, one must place him within the broader movement of modernism. Modernism emerges in a period of profound crisis, marked by the collapse of traditional belief systems, the rapid expansion of urban life, and the psychological impact of industrialization and war. In such a context, the stable, linear narratives of the 19th century no longer seemed adequate. Reality itself appears fragmented, subjective, and uncertain. Joyce's response to this crisis is not to abandon narrative, but to transform it. Instead of focusing on external events, he turns inward, toward consciousness. He attempts to capture not what happens, but how it is experienced. This shift is most evident in his use of what later came to be known as stream of consciousness, a technique that seeks to represent the continuous flow of thought, memory, and perception. However, it is important to note that Joyce's use of this technique is not merely formal experimentation. It is grounded in a philosophical conviction that reality is not objective but mediated through consciousness. What we experience is not the world itself, but our perception of it. Before Joyce arrives at the fully developed modernist prose of his major works, it is essential to consider his early experiments in poetry and drama, for these works reveal the gradual evolution of his artistic vision. In his first work, Chamber Music, it consists of a series of lyrical poems that at first appear conventional. The narrative of Chamber Music begins in the bright, pastoral greenwood of young love, where a musician poet serenades his beloved with a series of delicate Elizabethan-style lyrics. The early songs are full of sweet chords and the innocent anticipation of a lover waiting by a window or a gate. However, as the cycle progresses, the mood shifts from the sunlit grace of a spring morning to the shadows of doubt and the coldness of autumn. The intimacy of the lovers is gradually replaced by a sense of cold winds and a lonely hearts, suggesting that the music between them has fallen out of tune. By the end of the collection, the lover finds himself standing alone by the sea, watching chariots of grey clouds and hearing the noise of many waters. The story concludes not with a wedding or a vow, but with a haunting image of the solitary poet being called away by the wind, his chamber music, silenced by the vast, indifferent sound of the ocean. Their musicality, simplicity, and focus on love suggest an affinity with earlier poetic traditions, particularly the Elizabethan lyric. However, these poems are not merely imitative. They demonstrate Joyce's early fascination with the sound of language, with rhythm, and with the emotional resonance produced by verbal patterns. Even at this stage, language is not simply a vehicle of meaning, it is an aesthetic object. His later collection, Pompianiac, reflects a more mature sensibility. The story of his collection is one of a weary traveler looking backward through a dark lens. Unlike the sunny, courtly love of chamber music, these poems are set in the damp, colder climates of Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. The narrative begins with a sense of lost youth and with the weight of grey years. We see a father watching his child in A Flower Given to My Daughter, where the beauty of the moment is shadowed by the knowledge of inevitable decay and the darkness of the future. The poems move through scenes of heartbreak and betrayal, where the landscape, the slumbering river, or the windy moor reflects a soul that has grown old and grey. The cycle culminates in a sense of isolation and the shame of past desires. It is the story of a man who has traded the easy melodies of his youth for the penniless truth of his maturity, ending with the poet standing in the rain of his own memories, offering his verses to the world as a titille or an extra measure of his own suffering. The poems engage more directly with themes of time, memory, and loss, suggesting an increasing awareness of the complexities of human experience. Yet, they still remain within relatively traditional forms, indicating that Joyce's radical experimentation had not yet fully emerged. Joyce's only play, Exiles, represents his engagement with dramatic form. Influenced by Ibsen, the play explores themes of freedom, fidelity, and psychological tension. The relationships between the characters are marked by ambiguity and emotional complexity, raising questions about trust, desire, and autonomy. However, the play does not achieve the formal innovation of his later prose. Instead, it serves as a transitional work, revealing Joyce's interest in psychological depth and interpersonal dynamics. Another crucial text in understanding Joyce's development is Stephen Hero, an early version of what would later become a portrait of the artist as a young man. In Stephen Hero, Joyce adopts a more expansive and explanatory style, providing detailed account of Stephen's experiences and thoughts. However, this approach lacks the subtlety and precision of the later novel. The transformation from Stephen Hero to portrait demonstrates Joyce's movement towards compression and suggestiveness, where meaning is conveyed not through explicit explanation but through structure and texture of the narrative itself. Joyce's first major work, Dubliners, might at first appear to be a conventional collection of short stories. However, a closer examination reveals that it is structured around a central idea, the condition of paralysis. The narrative moves chronologically through the human lifespan, starting with the quiet, eerie disillusionment of childhood and ending with the cold, existential stillness of old age. We begin with young boys who dream of the Wild West or exotic bazaars of Araby, only to find themselves standing in the dark, realizing their dreams were merely vanity. As the stories transition into adulthood, we see Dubliners trapped in kinetic cycles of failure. A young woman, Evelyn, standing at a dock, unable to board the ship that would take her to a new life. A man, little Chandler, realizing his poetic soul is smothered by his mundane marriage. And clerks who drink away their dignity in dingy pubs. The plot of each story is not an action, but a sudden epiphany, a flash of realization where the character sees their life for what it truly is. the collection reaches its grand symphonic finale in The Dead, where Gabriel Conroy, a man of social standing and intellectual pride, is humbled by the ghost of his wife's past lover. As he watches the snow fall outside his window, he realizes that he and all of Dublin are fading into a grey universal oneness with the dead, marking the ultimate realization that in a city that cannot move, the only progress is toward the grave. Now, while the map above illustrates Joyce's Dublin, the paralysis of Dubliners is best visualized as the static, frozen moments of these 15 stories. Paralysis in Joyce's conception is not merely physical immobility, it is a psychological and moral condition. The characters in Dubliners are trapped not by external forces alone, but by their own inability to act. They are aware of their situation, yet unable to change it. This creates a tension between knowledge and action, between awareness and transformation. The concept of epiphany is central here. Joyce defines an epiphany as a sudden moment of revelation, in which the true nature of a situation becomes clear. However, unlike traditional narratives where realization leads to a resolution, Joyce's epiphanies are often paralyzing. The characters recognize their limitations, but this recognition does not empower them. It immobilizes them. In The Dead, for instance, Gabriel Conroy's realization of his emotional inadequacy does not lead to change. Instead, it produces a sense of existential stillness, symbolized by the falling snow. The snow covers both the living and the dead, suggesting a kind of universal paralysis where distinctions between life and death begin to blur. In Ulysses, Joyce extends the techniques developed in portrait to an unprecedented scale. The novel is structured around a single day, June 16, 1904, in Dublin. Yet this ordinary day is transformed into an epic narrative through its parallel with Homer's Odyssey. This parallel is not merely decorative. It serves to elevate the mundane, suggesting that the experiences of ordinary individuals possess a complexity and significance comparable to that of epic heroes. The story follows two lonely men wandering through Dublin, destined to meet but drifting in isolation for most of the day. We begin with Stephen Dedalus, or the Telemachus figure, who is living in a seaside tower, bitter and hydrophobe, mourning his dead mother and feeling spiritually homeless. Simultaneously, we are introduced to Leopold Bloom, the Odysseus figure, a middle-aged Jewish advertisement canvasser and a man of many devices. Bloom spends his day wandering the city, attending a funeral, visiting a newspaper office, eating a cheese sandwich, and dodging his wife's lover, while carrying the quiet ache of his son's death and his wife Molly's impending infidelity. As the hours pass, the narrative style shifts wildly from a clinical medical report to a hallucinatory source scene in a brothel, where Bloom finally encounters a drunken, spiraling Stephen. Bloom takes a fatherly interest in the young poet, rescuing him from a fight and bringing him home for cocoa in the middle of the night. Their meeting is brief and they eventually part ways, but it represents a moment of profound atonement between the fatherless son and the sonless father. The story concludes not with the men, but with Molly Bloom, the Penelope figure lying awake in bed. Her famous, unpunctuated stream of consciousness monologue flows through her memories of sex, loss, and youth, finally ending in a triumphant yes to life and to bloom. The novel is remarkable for its stylistic diversity. Each episode employs a different narrative technique, ranging from interior monologue to parodic imitation of historical prose styles. This multiplicity reflects the richness and the variability of human consciousness, as well as Joyce's refusal to confine himself to a single mode of representation. The technique of stream of consciousness reaches its fullest development in this work. Rather than presenting thoughts in a structured, logical sequence, Joyce allows them to flow freely, capturing the associative and often fragmented nature of the human mind. This is particularly evident in the final episode, Molly Bloom's monologue, which unfolds without conventional punctuation, creating a sense of immediacy and continuity. The reader is not observing thought from a distance, but experiencing it directly. Joyce's final work, Finnegan's Wake, represents the culmination of his experimental project. Here, Joyce moves beyond the representation of conscious thought and attempts to capture the workings of the unconscious mind. The story of Finnegan's Wake is a cosmic linguistic cycle that begins in the middle of a sentence and ends by looping back to its own opening line. It centers on the dream of a Dublin tavern keeper named Humphrey Shimden Yerwicker, or HCE, and his wife Anna Livia Pluribel, or ALP. But these characters are less people and more archetypes that shift identities through the night. The plot is triggered by a fall, modeled on the fall of the giant Finnegan from a ladder and the fall of man in Eden, which represents a shameful, unspecified sin HCE committed in Dublin's Phoenix Park. As he sleeps, HCE's guilt manifests as a trial where his twin sons Shem, who is the artist-writer, and Sean, who is a man of action being a postman, battle for supremacy, while his daughter Issy reflects his fractured desires. The language itself is a polyglot stew of dozens of tongues, reflecting the unconscious mind's ability to fuse all of human history and myth into a single moment. Finally, as dawn breaks, the perspective shifts to the wife, ALP, who manages as a river Liffey flowing into the sea. Her final monologue is a bittersweet surrender to the cycle of death and rebirth as the river pours back into the ocean, only to be evaporated and fall again as rain over Dublin. The language of the novel is radically innovative. It is multilingual, filled with puns, neologisms, and layered meanings. Words are not fixed, they shift, overlap, and transform, reflecting the fluidity of dream logic. The narrative itself is cyclical, resisting linear progression and instead suggesting a continuous process of transformation and renewal. This makes Finnegan's Wake an extraordinarily challenging text, but also a profoundly ambitious one. Joyce is no longer simply representing experience, he is attempting to recreate the processes through which experience is formed. Alongside his creative works, Joyce also produced essays and lectures that provide insight into his artistic philosophy. The intellectual journey of James Joyce's nonfiction is a narrative of calculated rebellion, tracing his evolution from a defiant student to a master of aesthetic theory. It begins with the youthful arrogance of force and drama and life, where he asserted the supremacy of the spirit over social convention, but it truly ignited with Ibsen's new drama, a review that signaled his pivot away from the Irish tradition toward European modernism. In his scathing manifesto, The Day of the Rabblement, Joyce declared war on the provincialism of Irish literary theatre, refusing to pander to popular taste, a stance he later refined in Exile through his traced lectures such as Ireland, Island of Saints and Sages, and his tributes to James Clarence Mangan. By the time he penned his analytical deep dives into Daniel Defoe and William Blake, Joyce had transitioned from a critic of contemporary culture to a philosopher of the static image, using these essays to build the theoretical framework of integritas, consonantia, and claritas. Ultimately, the story of his essays is the story of an artist meticulously clearing a space in the global canon for his own voice, ensuring that by the time he wrote his novels, the intellectual world was already prepared for the uncreated conscience he intended to forge. These writings are important because they reveal Joyce not only as a creative artist, but as a critical thinker deeply concerned with the role of literature in shaping cultural consciousness. We now arrive at the central text for examination purposes, a novel that not only narrates development but enacts it. At one level, Portrait is a Bildungsroman, tracing the growth of Stephen Dedalus from childhood to early adulthood. However, unlike traditional Bildungsromans, where the protagonist eventually integrates into society, Stephen's development leads him away from society. The novel does not culminate in harmony, but in separation. This is because, for Joyce, the artist cannot simply belong. He must stand apart in order to create. The story of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man begins with the wide-eyed sensory fragments of a child's world, the smell of a wet bedsheet, and the rhythm of a nursery rhyme, but quickly hardens into the rigid, cold reality of a Jesuit education at Clongowes. We follow Stephen Dedalus as he navigates the nets of a declining family and a colonized nation, eventually spiraling into a dark adolescence of lust and guilt on the streets of Dublin. This moral chaos is abruptly silenced by a terrifying sermon on the infinite agonies of hell, driving Stephen into a period of suffocating religious devotion where he nearly loses his identity to the priesthood. However, the true climax occurs not at an altar, but on a beach, where the sight of a girl wading in the tide serves as a secular epiphany, awakening his soul to the mortal youth and beauty of the world rather than the afterlife. Realizing that the artist must be a priest of eternal imagination rather than a servant of the church, Stephen rejects the demands of his family, his faith, and his country, ultimately choosing a life of silence, exile, and a cunning as he departs Ireland to forge a new uncreated conscience of his people. The most striking feature of Portrait is the way in which the narrative style evolves along with Stephen's consciousness. The opening passages are written in a language that mimics the perception of a child. The syntax is simple, the vocabulary limited, and the rhythm repetitive. The narrative does not describe childhood from an adult perspective. It reconstructs the experiences of being a child. As Stephen grows, the language becomes more complex, reflecting his increasing intellectual capacity. By the time we reach the later chapters, the narrative is dense, abstract, and philosophical. This stylistic progression is not merely decorative, it is structural. It ensures that the reader experiences development rather than simply being told about it. Thus, one must argue that in Portrait, form and content are inseparable. The novel does not simply depict the growth of consciousness, it performs it. One of the most powerful sequences in the novel is a retreat sermon on hell. Joyce devotes considerable space to his episode, and its effect on Stephen is profound. The sermon is not merely theological, it is sensory, almost physical in its intensity. It describes the torments of hell in graphic detail, appealing to fear, and imagination. Stephen's response is immediate and extreme. He becomes deeply religious, engaging in acts of penance and devotion. However, this religiosity is not based on love or faith. It is rooted in fear. He is attempting to escape punishment rather than seeking spiritual understanding. This phase is crucial because it demonstrates the power of institutional religion to shape consciousness. However, it also reveals its limitations. Stephen eventually recognizes that this system restricts his individuality. His rejection of religion is therefore not a rejection of spirituality, but a rejection of control. He refuses to submit to a system that demands conformity at the expense of selfhood. Stephen's turn to art represents a turning point in this novel. He begins to formulate his own aesthetic theory, drawing on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. He defines beauty in terms of integrity, harmony, and radiance, suggesting that art must capture the essence of an object in a way that produces a sense of clarity and completeness. However, beyond this theoretical framework lies a deeper conviction that art must be autonomous. It must not serve religion, politics, or morality. It must exist for its own sake. This is a central principle of modernism, and it distinguishes Joyce from earlier writers who often saw literature as a vehicle for moral or social instruction. Stephen's rejection of Ireland is one of the most controversial aspects of the novel. He refuses to define himself in terms of nationality, arguing that such identities are restrictive. Yet this rejection is not simple. Stephen is deeply aware that language itself is shaped by history and power. English, the language he uses, is not entirely his own. It is the language of colonization. This creates a tension. Stephen must use a language that is both his and not his. His task, therefore, is not to reject language, but to reshape it. It is why he speaks of forging the uncreated conscience of his race. He seeks to create a new form of expression that is not bound by existing structures. Stephen's decision to live by silence, exile, and cunning represents a strategy for artistic survival. Silence allows him to avoid being absorbed into social discourse. Exile provides distance. And cunning, it enables him to navigate systems of power without being controlled by them. This is not merely personal, it is philosophical. It reflects the modernist belief that the artist must remain independent, even if that independence comes at the cost of isolation. The mythological reference to Daedalus is central to the novel's symbolic structure. Daedalus, the craftsman who creates wings to escape imprisonment, represents the artist's ability to transcend limitations through creativity. Stephen identifies with this figure, seeing himself as someone who must construct his own means of escape. The myth also contains a warning. Daedalus' son, Icarus, falls because he flies too close to the sun. This suggests that artistic ambition carries risks. The pursuit of freedom can lead to deconstruction and destruction. The novel concludes with Stephen's diary entries, a shift that emphasizes immediacy and subjectivity. The narrative voice becomes entirely his own, free from external mediation. This marks the completion of his development. His declaration to forge the uncreated conscience of his race is both ambitious and ambiguous. It suggests a desire to create something entirely new, yet it also acknowledges the weight of cultural history. The literary career of James Joyce represents a singular, unbroken arc that moves from the rigid definitions of the intellect to the fluid boundaries of the universal dream. It begins with the essays, which serve as the artist's declaration of independence, where works like The Day of the Rabblement and Ibsen's new drama provided the intellectual weaponry needed to strike at the nets of family, church, and nation. This rigorous theoretical foundation was first tested through the rhythmic discipline of chamber music, where Joyce mastered the traditional lyre before choosing to shatter it. In Dubliners, he applied a clinical, scrupulously mean gaze to the social paralysis of his youth, a diagnosis that evolved into the deeply personal Künstlerroman of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Here, the Birth Epiphany and the flight of Stephen Dedalus signaled the transition from observing the world to reconstructing it from the distance of exile. This reconstruction reached its zenith in Ulysses, where the mythic method transformed a single day in Dublin into a modern epic, proving that the internal monologue of an ordinary man like Leopold Bloom is as vast as the wanderings of Odysseus. As the daylight of Ulysses faded, Joyce's poetry darkened into the melancholy snapshots of Pompeii, ultimately dissolving into the night language of Finnegan's Wake. In his final masterpiece, the individual ego of the artist finally emerges, and it merges with the collective history of humanity, completing a circular journey that begins with a child's sensory moo cow and ends with the river soul of Anna Livia Pluribel, flowing back into the sea. To study Joyce is to witness the total liberation of language, as he moved from writing about life to creating a text that breathes, dreams, and functions like life itself. James Joyce transforms literature by shifting the focus from external reality to internal consciousness. His works explore identity, language, and artistic freedom, reflecting the complexities of modern existence. Through techniques such as stream of consciousness and narrative fragmentation, Joyce redefines the possibilities of fiction. There will be a separate episode on the technique of stream of consciousness, which was explored not by Joyce alone, but by others contemporary to him. So stay tuned so that you may have the chance to explore these techniques and also listen to more such stories of literature.